Hi there, welcome back. This week we are going to be looking at CSS transitions, which is it's something that you can add to your web pages to make them a little bit more dynamic, almost like little just little visual effects that can make your content seem a little bit more alive and dynamic. They can be applied to both images and as well as text to many different elements. There's a ton you can do with them. We're going to start with this video. We're going to look at images, certain transitions and effects that you can apply to images, and then there'll be a second video where we'll look at text. So I will share my screen. And you'll find posted online a file for this week called Basic Transitions, which I've downloaded here. I'm going to unzip that. And in that, we have an HTML document, a CSS folder with 2 CSS documents, and an image that we'll just use as for our demonstration. So to begin with, I'm going to open the HTML document in Visual Studio. You can use whatever text editing software you're using. And I'm also going to open the styles document. We won't need to open as well. There we go. We won't need to open the normalized CSS, and we don't really need to open the image either. So I'm at the same time while I'm here, I'm going to double click the HTML document to have it open in Chrome, just because I like to have it ready. So I'm returning back to Visual Studio. There is my HTML page, which I've already done. We've already created like all we need to get started here. So it's loading the normalized CSS, and it's loading the style CSS. It's got a title and a description. And all we have on the page itself is an empty div, just to, again, so we're not working at the very top of the screen. And the CSS document, I've created some just basic default styling that will help. You'll notice the background color is gray. That will help later when we see some of the transitions that we add and effects that we add to our images. And I've just added some default styling to anchor tags and images as well. So if I come back here, you will notice the background is slightly it's like a light gray. So let's get started with some basic effects and transitions. So I'm going to come back to my HTML and leaving that, actually I'm going to leave that div at the bottom of my page. I said that was for the top. That empty one is actually for the bottom. So I'm just going to put a bunch of spaces in here just so I can work up here. And I'm going to add some comments as we go. So I'm just going to call this image examples. Oops. Just to make that stand out. So this is like the general section. And again, this document is something that we can keep and use as a reference later. And then I'm going to get a little bit more specific and say this first one is going to be an image contrast transition. Where to start here? I'm going to start with I'm going to load the image in the HTML, and then we'll address it through the CSS. We really can do one or the other, but let's start with that. So I'm going to open a new div. And in that, I'm going to load an image. I'm going to give it a class right now, even though we haven't created a class. I'm going to give it a class of image contrast. And then the source There we go. I'm going to use the little path, and there we go. The little code hint there. So navigate to my images folder and that example.jpg. And just going to indent that. So we've got a div, we've loaded an image into it, we've applied a class called image contrast. We haven't defined that class yet, but we will next. So I'm going to save that. And if I return to Chrome, hold down Shift and reload, I can see my image is loaded. That's the example image. It's not really doing anything. It's just simply there. So I'm going to return to my styles document, and now I'm going to start defining that. So I'm going to create a new section, transitions. Actually, because this is a section, I'm going to make it stand out a little bit more. Obviously, this is your document. You can do whatever you want, however you like to make that stand out. So we had, and this first one was a contrast transition. So we're going to be using the hover effect. So whenever our mouse hovers over an image, we want to see, that's when we're going to make that image change. So to get started, I'm going to declare that custom class that I applied in my HTML. Make sure I got it right. Image contrast. And I'm going to get right into the effect that I want when it hovers. So image contrast : hover. So whatever we type here is only going to affect that image when the mouse hovers over it. And we're going to use something here. We're going to use the filter function. And it's definitely something I recommend if you haven't worked with it before, should look into it. There's a lot you can do with filters. We're going to look at contrast for this, but there's brightness and I believe saturation and blur. You can blur images using filters. So definitely something that I'd recommend exploring and researching. Tons of information out there, very easy to apply. So in this case, we're going to just, as I mentioned, we're going to use the contrast filter. So we say we want to use a filter. The filter that we want to use is contrast. And then we need to say how much, what are we doing to the contrast? And in this case, let's increase it a lot, 250%. And then we finish that with our semicolon. So what have we done here? In the HTML document, we loaded an image and we applied the image contrast class to it. And now what we've declared for that image contrast class, that on hover, when the mouse hovers over that image, to apply the contrast filter and apply it at 250%. So it should boost the contrast 250% when we hover over the image. I need to save that. Oh, that's weird. Kind of compressed all my spaces, so that's fine. Return to Chrome, hold down Shift and reload. And now when I hover over, that filter gets applied and the contrast increases dramatically. Not necessarily something you want to do, but for the demonstration, for the purpose of the demonstration, I want it to stand out. So this isn't really transitioning though. It's coming in as very jarring. And what we're looking at this week is transitions. So this is where we can start applying actual transitions. So to sort of smooth that out. And how do we do that? Within that class, we type transition. And what we need to apply here is a value in time for this purpose. So let's do, I'm going to do something very slow. So we really see it. I'm going to do 5 and then S. That's 5 seconds transition. So this is telling the CSS to apply this filter, but to take 5 seconds to apply it. So save again, tab over to Chrome, hold Shift and reload. And now when my mouse goes over, that contrast is coming up very, very, very slowly. We can come back here, we can just change that. Let's go 2 seconds, save, toggle, reload, of course. And now that's taking 2 seconds to come in, and you can really put any time in there. There's one way that we can improve this, and there's something I don't like about this, and that is when I hover over, it takes 2 seconds to fade in. When I hover off, it snaps back, and it's jarring. So in this state, and this the way we configure the CSS here, we've applied the transition to the hover state. If we want to improve this, we can apply that transition to its non-hover state. Image contrast. So that's like the root state of this. And if I apply the transition of 2 seconds to it, oops, and I'm going to delete this. I don't need this anymore. Save. So now the default state, so the non-hover state, is the state that has the 2 seconds applied to it, and not the hover state. So that it has the 2 seconds. The transition is applied to the default state. So again, I'm going to save that, reload. Now it's still, my mouse hovers over, the contrast increases 250%. It takes 2 seconds to do that. And then when I hover off, it takes 2 seconds to undo that, to return back to its default state. So a little, well, I'd say much more pleasant. So, and then again, we can play with that time. I find that 2 seconds a little slow. So I'm going to go to 1 second, save, reload. And now it's just a quick little fade up and fade out. So that's a contrast filter. What else? Let's return back to our HTML, put another comment in, and we can look at, I'll show you image opacity transition. Put another div in there. And within that div, we will do the same thing that we did before. Image class equals image opacity, which we haven't declared yet, but we'll just do it here. And we'll, again, just let that autocomplete by, oh, I didn't, I jumped the gun there. Let's see if I can get it back. Source equals images example, there we go. That's it for this. I'm going to put, before we go, I'm going to put a break just between these images, so we get a little space between our images when we look at them. So a new div. Within that div, we're calling the same image again, but this time we have a new class called image opacity. We save, and of course we're going to come back here and we're going to have to declare that class. If I quickly toggle over here and reload that page, you'll see that image is there, it's ready. This is still has the proper class applied to it. This has a class that we haven't put any values in yet, so it's not doing anything yet, but the image is there. So I'm just going to comment up my CSS document a little bit more. And let's look at the same thing. So on hover, so image, like we can control the opacity of an image. So we can just declare that image opacity. Once again, let's start with the hover state. So this will be applied when the mouse hovers over that image. So it's a simple declaration is opacity. And here we put a value in that. So 1 is 100% opacity. 0 is 100% transparent. So 0 opacity. So the image would essentially be invisible. And then you can go in decimals between that. So let's go 1.2. So that would be 20% opaque. So 80% transparent, however you want to look at that. Again, on hover. So save that, come back here, reload, and you can see that. This is why I had the gray background applied. One of the reasons why, because we can actually see how that gray background is coming through. So again, we hover over, the image goes to 20% opaque or 80% transparent using the opacity command. And once again, it's a little jarring, so we can do exactly what we did before and apply a transition. And again, we'll apply to the root class. So it's, again, going to fade in and out and not just in. And let's do a decimal. We can do 0.5 seconds and save that, reload. And now we see that opacity fading in and out pretty quickly. And again, you can play with that time, 0.25 second, 0.25 seconds. Did I save that? Save, reload, even faster. And I mean, you can mix and match here. Like right now, we're sort of when you're going over the image, it's fading up to transparency. And when it's, sorry, when you're hovering over the image, it's becoming more transparent. You could flip those. And actually, we'll look at that in another example soon. Two more image examples to show you, I believe, here. Let's see here. If we want the, we can create the effect of an image essentially kind of subtly increasing and decreasing in size, if we'd like, or we can create an effect of almost it has a feeling of a white border around an image expanding or collapsing. So to do that, it's a little bit more complicated. Let's call this one. So I'm back into HTML. I'm going to comment this. Call it. I'm going to call it image shrinking. And let's see here. What do we need to do? This one will be a little bit more complicated. The first thing, the end effect that I want is an image with a white border around it. And then when I hover over that image, that border expands a little bit. So the first thing I need to do is, I'm just thinking where to start here. Well, this is what I'm going to just start as we have before. I'm just going to open a div and I'm going to load an image class equals, let's call it image shrink. Source equals images example. And right up here before I go, I think I want to put another break in. Helps with the spacing. For now, I'm going to save that. I'm going to have to come back to that. I'm going to reload. And there's my third image coming in. Again, not doing anything, but that's fine. So I go to return to my styles document, a new section in called image, I'll call it image shrinking. And I need to, let's just start with that. Image shrink was the class that I applied to that image. I need to start filling that in. Image shrink, yep, okay. All right, so image shrink, actually, I'm going to start again, image shrink hover. So on hover, what do I want that image to do? I want it to shrink down when I hover. Another command that you might not have seen, but can be useful, is transform. So similar to filter, we say we used filter, and then we said how to say what filter we wanted to use, and we used contrast, and then we applied how much contrast. Here we were going to do a transformation. We have to say what transformation we're going to apply, because there's a number of them that you can do. It's also something I would recommend looking into. In this case, we're going to use one called scale, because we want to transform the size of that image. We can use scale, and then now it's looking for a value. Again, 1 is 100%, so we can go smaller, bigger. Let's go smaller. Let's go 0.97. So transform when the mouse hovers on that image, it will trigger this transformation of the scale down to 97% of the size. Save, come back, reload. And there you can see, when I hover over that image, the transform function is being called, and it's calling the scale function more specifically and scaling it down to 97%. Doesn't take much percentage for it to take an effect. So I've got the transformation down, but I wanted a white border around it. And this is where I need to add a little bit more here. So there's probably a few different ways you could do this. I wonder if we could potentially do it with, with the border function. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to apply it to the div itself. So I'm going to create a new, called white background, a new custom class, and it's just going to be background color, and let's just make it white. So a new class called white background And all I've done is said, make that background color white. I'm going to return to the CSS, or sorry, the HTML. And in that parent div that my image is sitting in, I'm going to apply that class. And what did I call it? White background, I hope. Save, reload. And now when I hover over, we're seeing this white border because that div that image sits in has a white background. It's no longer, its default would be, I guess, transparent to show the gray background through. Now it's being told to be white. So when the image shrinks down, this white border is revealed. We're seeing the background of the div. If I wanted to make it so you see a white border and the size of that border is changing as I hover over, I'm going to return back to my styles document. I'm going to just sort of start tweaking this a little bit. So in my image shrink root style, so not the hover. So right now, the image is at 100%. It's filling that div by default. And when I hover over it, it scales down to 97%. But I want to see a little white border even before I start to hover. So I'm actually going to use the transform command again, scale again, oops, the round brackets, and then I'm going to put 0.99. So save that. So what I'm saying is that what I'm telling the CSS here at this point is when that image shrink class is its default non-hover state, transform its contents or whatever it's being applied to 99%. And then when you hover, that actually increases to 97%. So now when I reload, the default state for that image is to be 99%, which is revealing a bit of a white border because I've changed the background of that div to white. And then when I hover over, that it gives the effect of that border increasing in width, or the image shrinking down a little bit. And then finally, like everything that we've seen before, if that's that transition or that shift between those two states is too jarring, we simply come back, again, returning to the default state, the image shrink state, not image shrink hover, and we apply the transition that we want. And this can be, let's go 0.3 seconds. Save that, again, reload. And now we see just a nice little effect as we hover over that image. Seems like a lot of typing, but really, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't that much code. Three entries to get this effect, and it's something that could be reused again and again. One last image example. Kind of combining a lot of these ideas and even something that we looked at before. So I'm going to just put a comment in here, another HTML comment, but I'm going to remember this time before I do that, I'm going to put my break in, and then my comment here, I'm going to call this fading gradient overlay. And let's see what we're going to put in here. We're going to, as usual, create a new div. And then in that div, we're going to call an image class equals, let's call it image overlay. And once again, the source will be our example image. Save that. And then back in our styles, we're going to create a new section here called gradient overlay. So there are some quirks of transitions. It can't, one limitation is just using pure CSS, we're still not able to actually transition gradients. We can't use a transition a gradient, you know, from one gradient to another. It's just a current limitation. But there are, I mean, using what we've already seen here, we're going to kind of fake something, fake an effect that we want. So let's say in this case, I want the effect of when the page loads, there's an image and there is almost like a semi-transparent gradient over that image that fades away when I hover over that image. Now we can't transition a gradient, so that's going to be a problem, but we can transition an image. So we're going to create that effect, but in a way that to the user, it still looks like this gradient is fading away. But what's really happening is the image is fading up. So let's just get started here. I'm going to create a new custom class, and I'm going to call it gradient background. Spell. And in that, I'm just going to simply do background, linear gradient, and I'm just going to keep very simple, red to blue. So I've just created a class with the gradient. A new class with the background is a gradient that's fading from red to blue. Save. I'm going to come back to here, come back to my HTML, and I actually want to apply this gradient to my root div. The same way that we made the white background in the previous example, here I'm going to create the background of this div is going to be this gradient. So up into that opening div, class equals gradient background. So I call it. I save that. If I come back here and reload, I don't actually see much. There's that image that I loaded through the HTML already. But again, because the image is filling the div, I'm not seeing the gradient. Just to quickly demonstrate, I'm going to type this and then erase it. I'm just going to comment out that image for now, and I'll just put in some h1 test text. Save that, come back, reload, and now with that image removed and some content in that div, now I can actually see the background. So that div has a gradient background. It's just when the image is loaded into it, it fills it and we don't see it. Oh, I know it's there. So remove those comments. Save that. I'm going to return to here. So what class did I apply? Image overlay. So I need to start working on my image overlay class that I've applied to that image. I want to see that gradient when the page loads. I want to see that gradient kind of line over top that image. By default, that image is at 100% transparency, so I don't see that gradient. It's just sitting right on top of the gradient, blocking it completely. So what we can do, similar to what we did before, we can use the opacity command and make it by default. Let's make it 70% opaque. So this is the default state of that image, is to only be 7% or 70% opaque. Reload, and now we see it. To the user, it kind of feels like the gradient is lying on top of the image. That's the effect that we've achieved here, but that's, in reality, it's not actually what is going on. The image is sitting in front of the gradient, but the image is slightly transparent, allowing the gradient to bleed through. And then you could control how much of that gradient you see by altering the opacity of that image. So in that case, I went to 90%. I can sort of see that it's there, but it's actually quite difficult. Let's go 80, save. You know, it's coming up a little bit more, depending on how subtle you want it. You can do 78s and 82s, like really, really fine tune it. As I mentioned before, though, I want it to, when I hover over the image, I want that gradient to fade away. So to do that, but we can't transition gradients yet. So we're going to kind of fake it again. Image opacity is my class. Oops. Back in my CSS with the hover command. And now, so when I hover over, oh, it's not image opacity, it's image overlay. Oops, there we go. Oh my gosh. Overlay. On hover, what do I want to happen? Well, I want that opacity to increase to 100%, which we enter just by 1. Save, return, there we go. The gradient is disappearing. I mean, that's the feeling that the user gets, that the gradient is over top the image here, and now it's disappearing, when in reality, the gradient is there the whole time. It's just right now the image is semi-transparent, and now it's going 100% opaque, completely blocking out that gradient, which is still there hiding behind the image. And like everything that we've done here before, we can apply a transition. We apply it to the root state, so it fades in and out, and we can put whatever we want here. Let's put 1 second. Save, reload. And now the gradient is fading in and fading out on hover. So by playing with opacity and filters and transitions, and depending what you're applying and the hover state and where you're applying what, like there's a ton that you can do. Sometimes you have to get a little creative, but that's the fun part. So we looked at, this is the contrast filter that we looked at the first one. We looked at the opacity function. We used this was like the transforming the scale, and then finally kind of reversing the opacity, making the default state a semi-transparent, converting to 100% opaque on hover to lend this effect of a gradient being removed from an image when that's not the reality of what's happening there. using the transition timing on all of these to sort of soften and make that effect a little bit more pleasant and less jarring. So that is just some examples of some effects and transitions that you can use on images. I recommend you experiment and have fun with it. There's tons you can do. Knowing what you already know about CSS, I mean, the options are almost limitless. So yeah, just play around, have fun. And after this, the next video, we'll be looking at some transitions that we can apply to text elements.